Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I am Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, Des Moines, Iowa, on Iowa Catholic Radio, iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, and, of course, any of you good podcast listeners. My name is Bo Bonner. I'm the Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives and the Director for the Center for Human Flourishing over at Mercy College of Health Sciences. Bud, who are you and what do you do?
I'm at Mercy College of Health Sciences as well. I'm the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And, Bo, do you know what I call this time of year?
What?
This is Iowa State Fair Eve. When you're commuting on your way to work in the morning down 235, you can smell jalapeno corn dogs in the air.
Nice.
Maybe some seasoned fried corn.
By the way, just to point that out, bold move to start talking about it as fair fever. Are we outside of worrying about fevers? Next year they're going to be what is it, fair pulsometer, right?
Yeah,
is your blood oxygen ready for the fair?
I should be careful what metaphors I use, but the fair's...
That's not you, man. That's them.
Oh, that's their theme?
That's their theme.
I knew it was retro this year. I kind of like the 70s ambiance.
I do like that. I just was bold move, fair fever. I mean, I think that means any sort of worry about that stuff's officially over. So, there you go, man.
They've taken off their mask. No, I don't know.
Hey-o.
But I love this time of year, and really... I have to say, we've been spoiled. 2024 summer. Well,
up till
some of the storms have been bad, but the temps have been glorious.
I know. I mean, in fact, just earlier this week, I was telling someone that, well, first of all, I even got to go home to Oklahoma and see family, and even that was the 80s. The 80s in mid-July in Oklahoma is, I feel bad bragging in case we have anybody who's out in California or Nevada, but this week was really the first time where I got the old just sweating, sitting down Bonner problem in July. So my point is, we went really far into, we had that 1 week that was gross, and then we've had a great summer. Last
weekend we did a fire in the evening, and I just felt like I could go back inside and watch football. But I turned on the TV and it was soccer or something. So
that's right. It's Olympics.
Very disappointing. You know what's not disappointing?
What?
Studying health sciences at Mercy College.
That's true. mchs.edu. We can't promise that it's not going to make you sweat out some, some tests and stuff like that, right? Of course, it's hard work, but it's good work, the sort of work that when you get there, you can extend that healing ministry of the Sisters of Mercy, mchs.edu. We, of course, are finishing up the summer. If you want to do the fall, you better get to it. But we would, of course, love to have you there, mchs.edu.
Yeah, this is the time of year where I know you greet some of our new students. I've kind of dorked out on the show before and said, I'm kind of one of those nerds who gets excited to wrap the cellophane off the new textbooks and things. So whenever we start approaching September, it's an exciting time of year for me. I don't know. My kids aren't super thrilled about going back to school, but they'll get there. We do have a great show, though, for folks today.
That's absolutely true. We're going to wrap the cellophane off of some of the Catholic news that's been, in the news. Yeah. How many times can we say news in a minute, Bud? We're trying to go for a record. We don't always talk about, current events, and I think there's reasons why. We can talk about that, but we're going to dive into a couple, let's say, and think through maybe what some of the social ramifications of those things are. So this is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us, whether you're listening on the Iowa Catholic Radio airwaves, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, iowacatholicradio.com, or on podcast. Thank you for being with us. Bud, we are going to do something that we don't always do.
Yes.
We're going to try to talk about the news. Now, on one hand, it's not breaking news. It's just, round up. Enough stuff's happened this summer. We did this a little bit before a few months ago, I think, when we were talking about Twitter things that were going around. And so it's nice to spice up things and do that. Also, presumably something you get in the most trouble with, so hopefully people know that it's just Bo and Bud's opinions and not reflective of all of Catholicism or iowacatholicradio.com. But But I throw it over to you. Let's talk about the news.
Well, I think it's good that we don't fixate on the news too much on this show. I feel like with our theme of Catholic social teaching that we try to keep it on perennial ideas. And I think you can go back to most of our podcast episodes and really hopefully, I think, glean some truths without being too time-bound. We're like classics of the Western canon.
I do like that.
You can
Plato
listen
and
to
Aristotle
over and
over
over. But occasionally, you know, with the theme of the show being Catholic social teaching, it inevitably intersects with what's going on in the world. And I think some listeners do kind of appreciate that. And like you were saying, not that our opinions are dogma by any sense of the word, but that, you know, like Bo and Bud give a framework, I hope, to think about what's going on in the world. Of course, for the Catholic Church in the United States, a big event this past month has been the National Eucharistic Congress. And if you're like me and you're kind of like a church news geek or you're on social media, it was hard to miss this because a lot of our friends were there, prominent Catholic commentators, you know, like Bishop Barron, the Pillar, this news source was commenting on it, Katie Prejean, all sorts of folks. And so it was in my news feed. I don't know about yours. You're probably mostly reading about Pokemon and the Iowa State
exactly.
Fair.
Right. They showed a Pokemon version of it.
Okay.
A Minecraft version. No, I'm kidding. Yes. Impossible to miss. I think part of that is what could be commented on is I'm guessing most people, I mean, most Catholics, certainly, I think that this showed up in a lot of news feeds. I think people not Catholic in the news were maybe even trying to connect political events to this, which, again, on some hand is unfortunate if you're making too easy of a read. But precisely this idea that I'm guessing they didn't get to, that in response to world affairs, one of the things Catholics naturally think they should do is process the Eucharist throughout the United States and meet up and adore it. I hope that that's the sort of essential takeaway. Everything else that sort of emanates from it, whether that's what the people there felt like, what maybe we see, you know, in the general, what commentary we might give, I think the essential thing to say, bar anything else, is I like the idea that in a world where we were worried about what was happening, I don't think it was not for nothing that we, you know, the planners chose 2024 with a lot of, you know, big things, you know, coming to swell, that we, you know, we go through town with the Eucharist, praising the Lord and adoring it, and that in some ways that's the best commentary on anything, full stop. Now, but we got time to kill, so we'll go into more detail. But I do think that that's sort of like the pinnacle of that statement.
Yeah, and so what struck me watching from a distance, and I know some Des Moines Catholics, I didn't know the right way to put that, some members of the church from our diocese were down there.
Moines heads.
And I think, Bo, I was struck by like the fervor that you saw, and commentators pointed out there was like 60,000 Catholics in Lucas Oil Stadium for the closing mass. Like you said, the Blessed Sacrament was processed through the streets. And there's a real tradition of this sort of thing taking place. I know historically, even in large U.S. cities, you'd see this sort of thing, like San Francisco or Chicago, and you know, thousands would gather in a stadium for prayer or for procession of the Blessed Sacrament, etc. And so I think for a lot of Catholics, that was encouraging because, you know, with the grind of the news and even sometimes church news, like we can feel a bit beaten down. And so I think this sort of event is, I call it like a Mount Tabor experience. It's sort of like the transfiguration of our Lord, and you know how Peter is struck by what God is doing in their midst. Now, as homilists are keen to point out with that passage, you know, Peter almost immediately makes sort of a rhetorical slip where he wants to stay on the mountain and build a sort of chapel or booth to honor what took place there. And I would say this sort of thing can happen with the National Eucharistic Congress. So, I mean, we would be foolish, I think, to be sort of like Debbie Downers and sort of poo-poo, like, this was a great thing. You know, thousands of Catholics got together. There was a lot of fervor, and it was centered around the Blessed Sacrament. There was a phrase that I heard bandied about. I can't remember who exactly said it, but someone compared it to World Youth Day 1993. So this is, you know, periodically, I think it's every 4 years, the church does a youth day where in a city somewhere in the world, Catholic youth from around the globe will gather.
I think that's the Olympics. I thought World Youth Day. Well, maybe you're
Is
right.
it annually?
No, I thought it was every other year, but now maybe I'm thinking of Christ Our Life conference. There's a lot of conferences, so forgive us on air.
The Pope will often show up, and so 1993 I think goes back to Denver, and John Paul II visited the United States, and a lot of priests that you meet who are priests and religious who are in their, I was going to say, who are our age.
Yeah, exactly.
Mid 40s and up will cite this day as maybe like where they first heard the calling to their vocation. Some experienced conversion there. But this person being interviewed said, like, maybe this is our World Youth Day 1993. And I guess what struck me is, like, I'm not downplaying what took place there. And obviously a lot of vocations flowed out of it. But if you think from 1993 to 2023, like in the American Catholic experience, it was a turbulent time in a lot of ways. And so I guess like the takeaway is for those who are there to share the joy and, again, the fervor. I'm trying to think of the right word, like this right kind of zeal that they experienced there. But how do we translate that into what's taking place in the diocese on like a week-to-week, month-to-month basis?
Yeah, I think one thing that I'll overwhelmingly say is positive, and even in a sort of visual media sort of way. I know that I harp on all of these things. I worry about sort of production advertisement of the faith in general. I know that there's a lot of questions to be had on that you can't really slice and dice here in 5 minutes, let alone 20 or 40 or a whole week. But I think people who've listened to the show know that I have some deep-seated worries that carry over to a lot of things in sort of modern Catholic approaches to media and communications. But I will say, I think there's something, like you said, very medieval, long-lasting about people lining the streets to pay homage to Jesus Christ. And when we are able to use modern technology to sort of communicate those images, those exterior ones particularly, I think it's very powerful and sort of but a silent rebuke to one of the stereotypes, which is like, well, no one chooses to be Catholic anymore. There really aren't that many Catholics. I mean, we are bleeding Catholics, technically, if you're just looking at the sheer demographics. It's not something to paper over in any way. However, it's also really important to know that when we talk about bleeding Catholics, there were so many, bud, that even in 2024, with trend lines not necessarily going in our favor, you can have what happened in Indianapolis, and that's powerful, right? That, to me, is something worthwhile. Once they got in there, I was not there, of course, but most of the Bo-type worries start there. And part of this is what you're sort of getting at, which this was the daily Mass reading earlier this week, which is about what do we do when seeds fall in different soil, what happens? And I think, like you're calling these Mount Tabor events, if we don't approach them, like you said, not with only the right sort of zeal, but the right sort of discipline, the right sort of support, the community, we have the threat of a lot of seeds quickly blooming and then drying out in the sun. I think that that's like a sort of legitimate thing people are worried about. And I, coming from an evangelical background, worry about anything where the sort of emphasis is on enthusiasm and emotion. Now, I know that there were people, because different people talked about the sort of talks that they gave. I know people who are, great scholars, worried about the similar things that I am, and they talked about how powerful the experience is. I wasn't there, so I'm not blanket condemning those sort of things. I will, however, say what I can comment on, as any Catholic can, who saw the sort of way that it was shown in the media, the Catholic media. Is this fair to say?
Sure.
It really did remind me of stuff I think you and I are familiar with from Protestant world, which I think is a path we shouldn't take. Yeah. I know that there's people who go, oh, well, we should use any means necessary, but you need to, first of all, know, right? The means don't justify the ends. And it's not like that has been long-term successful for the Protestants either. Yeah. There's a lot of caution we should take from the Protestants who sort of did that, sort of go for the enthusiasm and see how that sort of sputters out at a certain time. Again, I'm not making a blanket condemnation about like being there. I'm talking about what was represented in the media. But I have to admit, I have sort of fundamental questions like, should you ever have a mass that large? I was at one. I was at when Benedict XVI was in Washington, D.C. At National Stadium. It's a very weird experience. I sort of wonder if it makes more sense to have like Vespers together. I know that makes me sort of like curmudgeonly, but like the dynamics of it, I think, make more sense. I think it's, I get worried about how we sort of even photograph and film the host in the monstrance. I have to admit, like, there's a way in which, I don't know, it comes off sort of flatter than the real experience can ever be. But for all those worries, and I mean, like, we're not even getting the ones about, like, did they spend too much money? Was this, like, the people who want to make this more political than I even think it really is. Yeah. I want to go back to say, in 2024, Indianapolis lined streets and shut down downtown for a National Eucharistic procession. And for that, I will be grateful, and I think that was presented well by Catholic media. That part was very powerful. When you got into the programming, like I said, I wasn't there. I know there were people who said there was great stuff going on, but the presentation based on sort of enthusiasm, which is an American temptation in nearly all things, but particularly religion, I would throw out a note of caution, similar to what you were saying about we have to come down from the mountain and do something about it when we get off the mountain.
Yeah, I was struck, kind of related to all that, by the closing homily. This was by Cardinal Tagle, who I believe is from the Philippines. And I'll just be upfront, like maybe a leader in the church today that I'm not instinctually like ready to listen to. But he had some good words, and he was talking at the end of the Congress about how the heart of what it was about should be missionary zeal. He said if we lack missionary zeal, that maybe part of it is that we don't fully appreciate the gifts that have been given to us. But I think actually his word and part of that homily kind of struck at a temptation that's maybe acute in American Catholicism, where he says, if our horizon is only that of achievement, success, and profit, there is no room to see and receive gratuitous gifts. There's no place for gratitude and self-giving. There will only be a relentless search for self-affirmation that eventually becomes oppressive and tiring, leading to more self-absorption or individualism. And so he says, even as we go about our work as the body of Christ, there's this temptation to kind of distill things down or to measure them by success and profit, and to kind of use the metrics that you see like in mainstream business or something like that. And he says, no, like we have to be about this missionizing call that's been given to us. Now, there's even some pitfalls there, because of course, like you were sort of mentioning emotion and enthusiasm against the backdrop of sort of like American religion, broadly speaking. When we hear missionary, we sometimes think, and again, this is kind of going back to my childhood experience, like cornering someone in an elevator and asking them, like, if you died tonight, do you know where you'd go?
Yeah. Roman road.
Yeah. Where I think what Tagle was trying to channel was this sort of like, of course, sharing the good news of what we received and having this kind of zeal for others experiencing the gifts that God has given to us. But connecting that to another talk that I kind of listened to briefly online, it was Bishop Barron. He was saying, like, even with Vatican II, so as we talk about the most recent church council, it kind of gets sometimes refracted through this lens of what's the relationship of the church to the world. And, people will quote that famous quote from John the 23rd, where he said, part of the goal was to throw open the windows of the church. And what we tend to have in mind is this idea that the church was like stuffy and stultified pre-conciliar era. And so it had to open the window so that like more light could be let in. And Bishop Barron pointed out like that sort of imagery can cut both directions. And he ultimately said like the goal was not to make the church more worldly, but actually to sanctify the world. And so the council was trying to give this clarion call, this vocation to all the faithful, where like whatever corner of the world God sends you to, like you take the light of the gospel and you use like the Catholic intellectual tradition and all the gifts of the church to bring light and to inform whatever you're doing out in the world. Well, not whatever you're doing, but those who have been called to politics or the legal profession or medicine, whatever it happens to be.
Well, and on that note too, because I think that those are great points. in thinking about criticism, again, there's criticisms that are just going to come up, like who were the choice of speakers, and clearly, you know how Americans are and are sort of like getting into factions. So one faction thought they were inspired, the other thought they were the Antichrist, right? Yeah. So like to me, it's not really worth commenting on that. One thing I will comment, and this again is sort of just a perspective as an outsider. Part of this is, I mean, look, I have, again, I have worries about all sorts of stuff. You guys know me. I'm your joyful pessimist here on the radio. What I will say is when stuff gets sponsored at religious events, it worries me. Now, part of this, Bud, might be Protestant background. I will admit one thing, you know, like people will talk about what was hurdles before they converted. And to be honest, like pretty quickly, I remember with both you and I, Mary quickly stopped being a hurdle. Like some people that took a while, but you know, just sort of patristic theology made me realize how important Mary is. I have to admit for a while, I was like, why do we have all these people's names on like windows and benches and stuff like this, right? That seemed just like sponsorship. Wasn't this simony? Wasn't this all these things like that? Now, probably a little bit of that. But the heart of that, right, and why it's so many names and not like corporations, is you're supposed to pray for those people because they're dead. And they're almost never supposed to be the person who paid for it, right? So I go and I pay whatever it takes to make the stained glass window, and I put, please remember the Bonner family in prayer. And the idea, right, is, and I mean, so if the National Eucharistic Congress was like such and such event sponsored by Debbie Schultz, please pray for her soul, that would have rocked, honestly. Like, that would have been amazing. The fact that we had sponsorships, and I mean, people will figure out which companies I'm most worried about sponsoring things. I think that is at least tacky, but I think it goes into my worries about any time we make religion utilitarian or what I call its narcotic effect. So, like, again, that's my worry about enthusiasm, is you go to the National Eucharistic Congress, other people go to, like, WWE, other people go to Taylor Swift. You know, so that's why I don't think we need to worry about trying to, like, one-up them or even match them, because, like, the idea about going to the National Eucharistic Congress should be completely different. That doesn't mean that it should be, you know, sad or not good or not like God deserves our highest praise. So I'm all for taking out all the stops to show that we believe God is worth our best efforts. But I think that's a different place to start from than how are we going to make this entertaining. But then that's the same thing with sponsorship. Look, there's nothing in religious life that can happen without, quote unquote, the technical word sponsorship. If it isn't for, you know, patronage, nothing in the church has ever happened. Absolutely true. But sponsorship has this sort of modern, again, utilitarian underpinning that worries me greatly. And that is another sort of public side of things that I know that there were people who were pointing to that on the interwebs, that they were trying to score political points. So I don't even care if it was like what side of the church's political arena was sponsoring things. And maybe this is sort of a call out in a much bigger way. I worry about sponsorships in the church. I love the idea of people paying, you know, patronizing things and then saying, please pray for my dead grandma. Yeah. That's awesome. And it's not much of a change. I think I would have liked to see something like that.
Well, and I think for all of us, whether we attend it or not, based on what you're saying, we have to ask ourselves, like, do we have ears to hear this year? Mm-hmm. Because I think about even with the Eucharistic Congress, and again, I hope this isn't like gratuitously critical, but like when you looked at the lineup, it was really celebrity Catholics. And that makes sense because when people attend something like that, they drive a long ways, they want to hear dynamic speakers. When you get into the Gospels and the New Testament, oftentimes God uses surprising voices. So you think about John the Baptist, you know, wearing camel skin and eating locusts and honey, a voice crying out in the wilderness. St. Paul talking about like how God uses the foolishness of the world to shame the wise. I'm all about, like, I jump on YouTube and I listen to some of these talks and things, but we also have to ask ourselves, like, even as we walk down the street, like the street preacher who's kind of like disturbing everyone's like comfortable experience of just walking downtown, is there a message there? And if not from him, certainly from scripture, not to lose sight, I think, of each week, like in the homily at our parish, where is God's voice speaking? So kudos to the members of the church here who visited. I'm excited to hear their stories. I think there's reason to really celebrate a lot of what took place there. We got to continue to have discernment and to seek where God is leading in our time and place.
Yeah, so summing it up, we thought everyone dressed too nice. Is that what you're getting at?
That's right.
No camel here. No,
Okay.
This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. We love having you with us through the airwaves, online at iowacatholicradio.com, on the Iowa Catholic Radio app, and, of course, through podcasts. Bud, we are talking about the news.
Yeah.
Not most of it, some of it, mostly just Catholic news that has sort of been the big talking points of the summer. So what did we wrap up in the first half, and what are we going to talk about in the second?
Well, I think it's worth leaving one more comment about what we were saying with the National Eucharistic Congress, and this will branch out into more like national news. So you and I both kind of hinted at the ethos of that event, and I think by ethos, one thing that stood out to me was that the entire like social experience was unified around Christ's presence in the midst of everyone. And to me, it was telling, Bo, that took place against the backdrop of the Republican National Convention and the craziness of really one of the crazier political weeks that our nation has experienced in recent memory. I don't have to go into all those details. I know many of you watch like the 5 o'clock news or read the news on a daily basis, but it was a reminder to me, Bo, and this part is hard to say without stepping on any toes, but like as Catholics, as the church, we have to constantly ask ourselves, like, how do we live faithfully in the world when so many different kind of motivations and news stories and information identities are being projected at us? And I think it was good for the church. Like, I got to tip my cap that against the backdrop of this really intense struggle for power in our society, that like many in the church took time aside, and instead of like throwing our weight behind that, we really did spend time in worship and prayer, hopefully to great fruit. And that's a challenging task. When I talk to Catholics in the pews after talks, after Mass, things like that, we inevitably, maybe not inevitably, but it's tempting to get pulled into sort of the mainstream discourse. And, you know, a lot of folks that you'll talk theology, and then at the end of it, they'll say like, well, who should I vote for? Or, you know, like it just gets into, yeah, that's nice. But like, there's this apocalyptic conflict almost where it's like the fate of the nation is in the balance. And it's funny, Bo, like not funny, but we can laugh at the fact that like each of the last 3 or 4 elections, it's been framed as the most important election of our lifetime. And with this one that's upcoming, it's like democracy is at stake. You know, you and I both studied with Stanley Hauerwas, who wrote a book about the peaceable kingdom and about how the church is meant to embody, to live out this different way of being in the world. And I think that's a good reminder for us this season that we do have to model and witness to this kind of peaceability that the world really struggles to find. And it's funny because when, against the backdrop of sort of like, so there was the assassination attempt on a former president, and that's shocking to anyone when that sort of thing happens. It's actually kind of a longstanding tradition in America. And sometimes in the mainstream discourse, I said it's funny, it's ironic that democracy is kind of framed as sort of like the alternative to other forms of politics, which are much more coercive. And yet in the actual practice of democracy, it's often a raucous show with some dramatic events that's sort of like giving charitable language to it all. And so I don't think for Christians that at the end of the day, we can say like, well, the default or like the answer to the sort of violence that we see around us is to bolster democracy. It's actually much more challenging, but much more interesting than that.
You know, the thing for me, I'd say the final point I would make is, again, in the images of the procession through Indianapolis with all those people there, I think exactly what you said is visually present, that no matter what the varied amounts of things that people think in that crowd, the idea that Jesus Christ is Lord and he is still king of our lives and processes through, and that we pay homage to him. I think that is a resounding response, but I want to be not a reactionary one, not a response that like reacts to like what the world does. It's the eternal response to the agitations of the world that, as you said, Christ yesterday, Christ today, Christ tomorrow, right? That Alpha and Omega, that he will not change. His love for us doesn't change. I will admit that the minute that you go into that arena and you start having talks, then people can like accuse you of quietism or you know, like, oh, so what are all you saying is that the Christian way is to not comment on important things in this life? And you go, no. And if certainly we can open ourselves up if what we're trying to say is that the church should never talk about politics. So that, I think, is a bag of worms, a bag of kittens. It's a bag of something. Letting it out of the bag, I'm confusing metaphors. But what I will say is, in the procession, and the idea that we can have the Eucharist, so to speak, start from different corners of the United States and meet in the middle of the country, to me, that is not quietism. That is the answer to, as you said, the factionalism that democracy demands that we have, and that when we're not practicing democracy well, you know, that divisiveness can be overcome only through the King of Kings and Lord of Lords.
And I think here in Des Moines, we have to sometimes step back and appreciate and celebrate what we have here. Des Moines, through a series of historical factors, one being sort of low cost of living, the ease with which like you can travel the city, and then post-Vietnam War, I'm blanking on his name, we had a governor who sort of emphasized being a refugee resettlement center. But by a series of historical circumstances, we've ended up being a very diverse Catholic community. And so I'm struck many times by the fact that here in Des Moines, you know, we have Vietnamese Catholic, Latinos from different parts of the world, of course, Anglos and Europeans and things. And we're all
Sudanese.
Yeah, integrated into the mystical body of Christ. And so it's not like a sentimental thing. There's actually a political body that weekly gathers around a table, altar of sacrifice, and brings together people from all parts of the world and forges this kind of unity that the world has a really hard time imitating.
So what else do we got news-wise that you want that we're going to throw out there?
Well, for Catholics, of course, like if you jump on like Catholic News Agency or one of those other outlets, like one thing that's coming around the bend is the next phase of the Synod on Synodality. So this is, I guess you could call it a global meeting of Catholics. We've touched on this in a previous episode. Synodality actually is a venerable tradition in the church. Eastern Christians maybe can wrap their minds around it better because it's sort of a standard part of how they practice ecclesiology. So ecclesiology is a technical term about the theology of the church, church life, church practice. And synodality, like a synod, is meant to be a formal gathering whereat leaders of the church gather around to discuss important topics, whether that be doctrine on some occasions. Other times, it's more so the application of doctrine. For various reasons, this has become kind of a contentious issue in Roman Catholicism, I'll say. I'm using that term loosely, but most of the participants in this current synod are more so from like the Roman Rite. Of course, it embraces all who fall under the Pope's governance, but without that sort of like standard practice of synodality in the Roman Catholic Church, Catholics on the ground, at least I've talked to them, you see this in articles and blog posts, are sometimes a little bit puzzled, like what's going on here. I think if you listen to the Holy Father and as he's framed it, he thinks these sort of gatherings are important in the sense of being what he would describe as like a listening church. And the church, he might say, especially like at the Episcopal level, is often ready to talk and to preach at, but we have to set aside occasions where listening takes place and discernment. You know, our Pope comes from he is a Jesuit, and so this term is key in sort of like their own life on a regular basis. And what's kind of characteristic or stands out about synodality as it's being organized right now is it's meant to bring together a diversity of voices, and so not simply being a gathering of bishops, but of all the faithful. Now that's hard to pull off because you can't really even if you said like, let's get a representative body to fly people from around the world into one place, it's inherently going to have like a certain level of selectivity. And I think that's what's created some of the suspicion around synodality, where it's like, who's really guiding these conversations and where are they going?
Well, I think the problem, of course, is when we think of listening in groups for the sake of governance, putting it very generally, it is very hard for anyone in the West to not have sort of bureaucratic managerial ideas in mind of what's going on. What I think, I mean, and look, I'll even like cede to people who say, oh, well, the American Catholics in general bristle against this because there's a very, they blame it on American individualism or whatever. And I mean, there's actually aspects of that I would even say is true. But I actually think it's American collectivism that's the problem. So the sort of collectivism that usually ends up happening in the United States is not a very communal one. It's not like tribal. It's not even sort of European law-based, right? Like, common law is the sort of law of the land, but then to fill in those gaps, funny enough, but to bring in other news, the sort of Chevron case of the Supreme Court, where there's this idea that you can sort of pass laws and then the executive branches can sort of fill in what it means to follow those laws. So how does that happen? Well, so executive branch hires people and then they open up policy decisions for public commentary. But the only reason that I think we have any insight into this is since you and I have worked in higher education, we've been more involved in the administration part than either of us ever signed up for, when we were in our 20s. Yeah. If you go read the Department of Education's policy statements and then read the public commentary section, it is mind-numbing. And the thing is on one hand, you can read all that and go, okay, well, I guess it's good it's open to public commentary. But you really quickly start to know who are the only people that have time to go make public commentary. And that this starts to be, under the guise of it being open to public commentary, it becomes inside baseball. And you're like, there's probably no 30-something mom or dad at the PTA running up to the Department of Education and making public commentary. It's like perfunctory, like they need to do this. But when perfunctoryism takes 100 pages and it makes your eyes glaze over. So anyway, my point is, it's actually, sure, American individualism and I can go my own way. It definitely has a part of it. I actually think it's sort of American bureaucracy that makes people very wary of this. And the fact that it sometimes looks like it's sort of treading the same direction, that if you go out, bud, and you go, okay, well, we're going to listen for a few years, but then we're going to go ahead and just decide anyway, or we're trying to go find the voices we want to hear, even if that's just a perception, that is poison to the capacity to make this work. And bud, to me, this in some ways is less a criticism of the synod on synodality, and it's more sort of like a commentary on how modern people do communal decision making. Like, we're really bad at it, bud. Yeah. And I think everyone out there can remember a time, whether it's like an HOA, a PTO, like something at work, where a discussion that was advertised as being open and can go any direction, you get there and you're like, oh, they knew what they wanted the whole time. And there were plants in the audience that asked particular questions. And on the converse, bud, people have been responsible for things where we want something to work that way, and we're like, we have to run this in front of everyone. So what do? Yeah. We better go ask all of our friends to show up at this public meeting. And so I actually think this is sincerely an area where the worldliness of how most bureaucratic coming togethers go has poisoned the ability to really even get into this well. So what I'm arguing, bud, is, I actually think there needed to be, before we had the synod on synodality, maybe we needed the catechism on church synodality. Mm-hmm. And some of the people who need to listen to it most are probably functionaries in the church, because of course, bud, where did they learn to do communal stuff except through the bureaucratic secular world that they grew up in. And I mean, so America has their own, but like clearly Europe has its own issues and Latin America. I mean, you can see all this where the different world groups are being frustrated in certain ways. And then conversely, places like parts of Africa, like I especially think of like Nigeria and its robust, Catholic traditions. They're kind of like, we've done something like that's synodality, and actually is sort of like much more a living culture within their culture, right? Like, why aren't, and so there's a sort of question of like, well, why wouldn't you take examples from them? So I think that's where a lot of this worry comes from, and why we have. So are there people who it's like individualism? Yes. Are there people who are just going to, chomp the bit against the Holy Father no matter what? Absolutely. I actually think, though, that a lot of people have a lot of lived experience that makes them worry about these sort of meetings, and it's actually their secular world and not the church world that makes them worried about it.
Yeah, what I'm about to say is a bit cliche, but I think it's really true. In moments like this, we have to trust God, that God is still guiding his church and in control. And the reason I bring that up, Bo, is you and I have both had the privilege of studying church history. And I'm sorry, but like to get overly stressed out about this sort of thing is, I think, not to see the panorama of salvific history. So even things today that are like pillars of the faith for us, you think about the Nicene Creed that we recite each week at Mass. The Council of Nicaea settled an important question. The decades after that were really embroiled in controversy. And, there were like St. Athanasius, the great defender of Nicene Christology, was exiled. There were bishops who were at least weak-willed, if not
complacent.
Right. And so with the Synod on Synodality, I don't see, we're always walking this fine line. When we talked about being salt and light in the world, you mentioned that like someone might hear us as like advocating quietism. It's similar when we bring up these sort of controversies in the church. I don't think any official participants in the Synod maybe listen to our podcast, but I hope with the Synod that they keep as their lodestar revelation.
Yeah.
And when we talk about discernment in the church, it always has to be guided by the deposit of faith. I was going through the working document, and it said that part of what the Synod is about is discussing how all the baptized can better serve the Catholic Church and help heal humanity's deepest wounds. Like which Catholic could be opposed to that sort of thing?
Exactly.
And yet I hope those who are guiding, especially bishops, they recognize that this has created like some stress on the ground. And why is it that members of the church are sort of like anxious about where this thing is going to go? And that's where you got to come back to God's original message to us. And I know that's not simply straightforward. I don't want to sound like a biblical fundamentalist, like it's on paper, just read it and do it, right? And you mentioned the global character of the church. The church has been, like, in some ways, even after like half a century, the message had been spread throughout most of the known world, right? When we talk about empires and things like that. And then very quickly after that, it went to like the far reaches of the European continent and different things. Of course, post-Enlightenment was characterized by mission work to Asia and things like that. And so it's not that the church used to be, what word am I looking for? Like parochial, and now it's cosmopolitan. But it's always been cosmopolitan or having a far reach in a certain sense. But today, and I'm going to broach a topic where we just have a couple minutes left, really the influence of different kinds of media have made the pace of our conversation so much more quickly. And that calls for a lot of responsibility on our part.
Yeah, and I mean, overly quickly, to make another sort of figure ground argument, which go listen to past episodes where we talk more about it. So sorry for being a dork. But I'll say this. So another dead horse we're always kicking, the Russell Hittinger point, that we talk a lot about policies, but not principles. But then this creates this counter reaction that's not good, that some people decide that what principles are the answers. And so if you have the principles, there's no further discussion. But the virtue, right, is the incarnation, right, of both. The principles are, like you said, the guiding star, the window we look through. It's the foundation that, like, if we keep asking about things on the ground and what policies we might do in the here and now, always in reference to, like you said, revelation. It's not that revelation gives quick answers. Revelation will always give us the boundaries to talk about these things well. And so we, and I think this goes into a lot of things about, again, utilitarianism, another dead horse I'm always kicking, that we either want to go, what do we do right now? We need to listen to people and respond exactly to what they say. Or people go, there's these principles. Why aren't we just following them? Principles frame contexts that we then can talk about content well. Principles ground discussions, so then the figures that we have to debate that are live questions and difficult can actually be spoken of because we don't have to start from ground zero every single time. You can even talk about principles that eventually need to be questioned themselves, but that can only happen in the greater net of other principles. And I feel that this is exactly what media exacerbates, because we go and say we need to listen to people, and then you're like, well, why are we only listening to people who have complaints? So because some people are like, why aren't we listening to people who are happy with the church? But then other people go, well, if you're worried about those complaints, why aren't you worried about people being uneasy about the synod itself? And so then there's this big competition about, well, what policies should we worry about? Well, we have to define the principles. And I think that that's what actually synodality used to be good at, right? It's like you sort of declare a symbol of the faith. Like, we're going to recite the Nicene Creed together, and by golly, whatever we consider, we're going to try to like make it relate to the creed. A lot new can come from that, but it will be grounded in a stable way. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show, be that on Iowa Catholic Radio's radio network over the airwaves, iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or our wonderful podcast listeners. Well, Bud, if people were thinking we were going to hit like a ton of news stories, they should know us better. But I do think that we hit two very relevant ones, and I hope people saw that we weren't just trying to make cheap commentary. You know, it's possible to sort of just go off of that last thing we said. It's possible if you approach the modern world and its news with the principles of Catholic social teaching, that you might be able to dig a little deeper and maybe not just be blown in the winds of sort of popular enthusiasm, rooted in the gospel, hopefully be able to make some deep impressions of what's going on and move forward in that way.
Yeah, no, I think at the end of the show, hopefully we came back especially to what it means to be the body of Christ in the world and gave some folks some good things to think about there. Less seriously, Bo, your family inherited a pretty cute puppy this week. Ollie. What sort of?
Ollie Nix.
Nix.
That's what we're going to go for.
After Bo Nix?
No, after Kyle Nix from the Turnpike Troubadours.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
And he's kind of, he's Corgi mix.
Yeah, so I guess we'll go find out exactly, but I think Corgi and Beagle is what we're settling on. So because I was pretty cute.
I was thinking about this show, and like having our grills up on promotional material may turn people away. But if we put Ollie on, like, listen to the Uncommon Good, and he's like tilting his head, waiting for a treat.
I didn't even think about that. The way to exploit the new dog for listens. Like, I've not really been doing my job, bud. You're right.
Well, pray for us. Pray with us. We pray the Rosary on air daily, so 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. The Chapel of Divine Mercy at 2:55 in the afternoon. You can also jump on the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the Rosary anytime, anywhere.
So coming up on events, iowacatholicradio.com, and then you can go look at events. So July 24th, that already happened. Never mind. Don't listen to me. So wait, Ragbry's going on? Is wrapping up?
I feel like Ragbry's low key this year.
Well, I mean, they went.
This is the first time
crazy.
Hearing of it.
Yeah, I know, right? Like, I think everybody's just taking it easy. Okay, August 2nd. So that's coming up. We got the first Friday Mass at Iowa Catholic Radio, August 8th through 18th, as to your point about the eve of the fair. So Fair Fever, join Iowa Catholic Radio staff the entire time over by the Ann and Bill Riley stage. They got special guests that are singing. And then, of course, September 1st is the Iowa Catholic Radio Family Celebration. That's 4 to 11 o'clock out in West Des Moines. And then Christ Our Life Conference, September 28th through 29th. But, of course, it's always important to tell people that this ministry is not just the folks who hear on the airwaves or behind the boards or behind the desks. It's your ministry as well. You make that possible through your prayers, through your being able to volunteer. but very much materially through your donations. So 515-223-1150 or iowacatholicradio.com to donate. Thank you for donating all that you make you make this possible. You make this a ministry that we can all participate in together. Thank you. Please keep us in your prayers and in your donation plans. Bud, I think the most current news is we had a good show.
Yeah, that was fun. Always great to have you all with us. Please do pray for us. We're praying for you.
So this is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for the Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.